I think there's been an interesting conversation that's been teased out this morning by a variety of speakers. And really this is about this general idea of sustainable cities, which obviously cuts across a wide variety of different topics. What we're looking to talk about in this discussion is the idea of urban design and planning principles. What are the principles that really should be governing sustainable cities or smart cities, or whatever we want to potentially call them? And in extension to that, how do we make that more citizen-centred or user-centred? I think has been, and certainly my own personal view, is a lot of this has to do with how we potentially bring in landscape design and landscape planning sensibilities to our community design to achieve some of these ends. So what we're going to try and do is sort of pose a few questions to the panellists that really specifically target those three key areas, and have them sort of talk through what they feel are the responses that we need to be focusing on. And of course, there will be an opportunity at the end for you to pose questions to the panellists as well. I'd like to start off first by just talking about the panellists' view on sustainable cities, and really, what are they? What are sustainable cities? What do they look like? How are they powered? What are the key ideas that underpin a sustainable city? And perhaps we can start with Chris for this question.
Hi. I think one of the most important things for a sustainable city is you should not sacrifice future generations' ability to meet their own needs. I mean, that's fundamentally the criteria for sustainable living in general. It's also important to realize that we've forgotten about sustainable living. It's not new. All of our forebears lived sustainably in probably small communities. The people that lived in this region centuries ago lived sustainably. They lived within their means. They had no choice but to live within their means. For centuries, we've forgotten that. So I think now we're trying to start again. The world population has doubled since I was born. That's an extra 3.5 billion people on the planet. We heard earlier there are around 3.5 billion people already living in cities. There's more to come. So a sustainable city is not just what we build today as a sustainable city, it's what we do with our existing cities. Some of them are 50 years old, some of them are centuries old. How do you build a brand new sustainable city? That's a great challenge that architects and developers we want to do. You start with a clean sheet of paper. I think the reality is how you modify the existing cities. Dubai is a young city, but we still have to modify it as well as develop it as a sustainable city. And I think that's one of the most exciting challenges. I think we all talk about live, work, play, thrive and survive. We want to create an environment where people can live, people can work, people can learn, people can grow without relying on non-sustainable means, transport, energy, population density. And I think emotion is a huge part of sustainable living, the emotional sustainability.
Yeah, and I think and you've touched on some points there where you've talked about elements of what is a sustainable city. There's often a kind of idea that they look a certain way. To you, are they? Is it about the physical components, or is it about the way they work, or is it some sort of combination?
I think it's very much a combination. I think if you look at it in isolation, you won't get what you need. I think historically, or the second half of last century, a lot of people were looking back in terms of sustainability. There are a lot of communities around the world where people have gone back. They live off-grid, they create small communities, and they can live sustainably as they did in the past. Today we have to take it further. We have to be able to accommodate cities of 12, 15 million people. It's not just about living in an energy neutral box. It's got to incorporate the landscaping and in the environment and how you work, how you get to work, how you interact, how you support your existing community and culture. That's a huge factor in what a sustainable city here will be very different from one in Europe, will be very different from one in South America, because the culture is an important factor as well.
Yeah, I think clearly I'd say most of the panel will probably agree that the social dimension is an important part of sustainability as well. I'm just wondering whether perhaps, Phil, you want to tell us in particular the way that sustainable cities are powered, having direct and probably the most relevant experience of all of us.
Sure. Well, I'm not sure. I think most of you have heard about the sustainable city in Dubai now. So it's a community just out of Kuja Road behind Arabian Ranches. There's 500 villas there. There's a population of around 2,500 people, and it was built really taking the 3 pillars of sustainability into account. So social, environmental, and economic. So if we build a sustainable city, I think, to speak to your point, the most important part is that people live in that city sustainably. But we have a fairly simple formula of how we do that. So the 3 pillars of social, environmental, and economic. And then under the environmental part, we break it down even further. So we break it down into food, energy, water, products, mobility, and waste. So the idea is that the city grows as much food as possible so that you localize the food source. You've heard a lot of talk about food security. That's a really, really important part, especially in this part of the world where 80% of the food is imported. So to reduce those food miles and to incorporate urban farming and food generation into the community is really important. And the landscape really is the key to that. It's a really key role. So we have what's called a productive landscape. So instead of the planting just being there to be beautiful, we incorporate it into growing food, fixing nitrogen, microclimate. So everything has more than one purpose there. Energy is very important. We've chosen to have solar as our renewable energy supply, but other communities might choose different things based on where they are. And we incorporate demand management at the root of that. So really it's to try and lessen the amount of energy, first of all, that the community needs by being very efficient. And we have a whole multitude of ways we do that, but just through proper orientation and insulation of the buildings, you can achieve a lot. And then the high efficiency systems on top of that even add to it more. And then as the icing on the cake, we add solar panels onto the roof of all of our buildings. As far as the water goes, we recycle it 100% within the community. So we separate it into gray water and black water systems and then reuse it for irrigation, for all the productive landscape, but also the other landscape, the buffer that goes around the city, which helps with our air quality. As far as if we get into to the waste part of things, we have Tadweer, which is a sister company of ours. So we recycle into 5 waste streams: glass, plastic, paper, metal, and general waste. We try to compost as much as we can within the city and then reuse that compost as an amendment to the soil to help hold moisture. And mobility, we really look at limiting the amount of transportation within the city. We look at connecting our city to the greater part, and then we have electric car parks. For when the mass adoption of electric vehicles start to happen, we have charging stations that will allow people to charge their vehicles from the power that's generated over top of the car parks by the solar panels. So really, we look at a holistic approach to designing the city. There's nothing new there, but it's a lot of best practices and a lot of good ideas put into one place.
I'll just disagree with you on one thing, Phil. It is a new idea in that it's been successfully combined and built, so I think you should be congratulated on that. But it seems like what's very clear in what you're saying about sustainable city is that the idea is the landscape is a kind of green infrastructure. It's not a passive envelope. It's formative. It has a sort of fundamental impact. Can you sort of explain, just in a quick bullet point, the kind of things that you do in the landscape?
Yeah, so that productive landscape that we have is growing food, but it's also there to help to clean the air. It's there to help to cool the city as a microclimate. We use it as part of our water cleaning as well to help to take some of the dissolved particles and the nutrients out of the water as part of our grey water treatment facility. So we really try to integrate it into to many components within the city. And it is the landscape first and then the building second. So when we designed the city, we really looked at that. and made sure that the buildings were integrated well into this productive working landscape that was serving many functions, a multiple of functions within the city.
I'd just like to also turn briefly around from the master plan and turn to the other perspective of the end user. And I wanted to potentially ask Dan, in particular, some of the work that Place Dynamics has done has been very sort of focused on the user experience and citizen-centric design approaches. How do you think that sort of folds into the sustainable city paradigm, and from your perspective, what is essential for us to look at in that respect?
Yeah, well, the very core of what we do as placemakers is people, essentially, and it's a very good component of placemaking that it doesn't necessarily work within the traditional silos of traditional disciplines. So we have architects designing buildings, we have engineers designing roads, and all very well, but there was never really a profession that was kind of looking at the holistic picture overall of all of these different disciplines. And placemaking is something that's probably more popular in the States and in Europe, but it's a profession which is actually looking at things much more holistically, and how people use space, how people enjoy space, how people remember space and move through space. So we as a company have kind of taken that on board, and we've tried to make sure that although we do have these distinct disciplines within our company, and we do obviously have to still bid commercially for work which is very much kind of still in these silos, we kind of make sure that everybody is chipping in and working on the same objective, which is to create good places. And one example that we are very proud of as a small company to be involved in was the City Walk project with Miraz. And that was really about trying to kind of understand how people in Jumeirah and visitors and tourists were using urban places and spaces, and what some of the faults were with other areas. And it's kind of fairly simple, we think. It's about walkability, it's about people being able to eat in a restaurant which is spilling out onto a street. It's about traffic being calmed so that it's not going at a fast speed where you feel intimidated and you can cross the road quite easily. So it's all quite, to us, it was quite simple stuff, but there was lots of different sort of obstacles stopping us doing some of those things. So we kind of came up with fairly non-standard approaches to design that was not being done elsewhere, and we had to fight a number of battles within various departments to get that achieved. But we've kind of created something which is, you know, it's kind of, its advantage is kind of behind the scenes, really. It's not something which is massively apparent, but it's something that we really fought for. So, you know, we're quite proud of that, and we are quite sticklers for this idea of placemaking and making places that are usable and functional for people.
I think, I'm sure that most of the panel would agree, and I think specifically to come back to the sense of how the wider landscape works in cities, and particular sustainable cities, I thought I'd pose the question to Rob Shakespeare, who's probably been in the region for about 15 years now, or thereabouts?
20 years.
Or 20 years, sorry, apologies. As a sort of landscape practitioner in the region, what's your thoughts on how responsive urban design can take a sort of landscape-first approach, and how that can then fold into sort of smarter and more sustainable solutions?
Well, I think to me it's hard to imagine how you could have a successful operating sustainable city without thinking about the landscape first. It sort of feels that, I mean, obviously we look at any city and you see the buildings and you see the roads and so on, but landscape effectively is public realm. It's not just the landscape. I think there's a sort of perception that landscape is just the trees and the flowers and so on, but it's so much more than that. And as Dan has alluded to, you know, placemaking is the key, and that involves all aspects of the public realm. And the public realm effectively is everything that is not the buildings. And to some extent, the way that we use cities, we use the spaces between the buildings more than we use the buildings themselves. I mean, obviously the buildings are crucial. So it's essential to have a well-designed landscape and take a landscape-first approach in order to create a sustainable city. And the reason for that is because we all use the landscape, and the city becomes far more effective if we can leave our building and walk somewhere. If we can, instead of using a car to drive somewhere, we can start our day by walking somewhere, maybe use public transport, and then walk to our office. So the landscape is not just creating the parks and the open spaces, it's also creating the connectivity and the links for us to use. And there's clear evidence that shows that if you are living in a city with good public realm and good access to landscape, you're psychologically healthier, there's greater economic value to your property. So cities thrive if they have a great public realm, a great landscape, because economically rents go up, people like living there. So there's a sustainability to it and a longevity to how a city is designed if the landscape is considered as a priority. And so I think that's why I think we would always take a landscape-first approach.
I wholeheartedly agree, and I think as someone who has an office based in Dubai Marina, some of the things that we've seen in existing developments or completed developments is the absence of a landscape-first approach has really detrimental impacts on the ability to come back and fix some of these problems later. It becomes a much more difficult retrofit in a way. And while Dubai is very well known internationally as this sort of new city, a skyscraper kind of city, one of the fundamental problems I think that we'll need to address is how we can actually create recreational space. And really the opportunity that we have now is also to look at landscape first, even when a project is quite substantially complete. We would certainly see the possibility of things like privately funded open spaces in a place like Dubai Marina, and really when you see an entertainment venue within a place like Dubai Marina really succeeding, it's because of sometimes there is a lack of open space. And the popularity of projects like the beach or City Walk are really about people expressing their desire for that landscape-first approach. I'd like to just quickly come back to Chris and just pose a question about sustainable cities again. I mean, UAE is already well known for its sustainable cities. We have Masdar and Dubai Sustainable City amongst others. But Chris, what would you say is the key takeaways for developing similar projects in the future with a mind to the sort of things we've been talking about?
I think Dubai is very well placed with a local and regional government that's very keen on promoting the sustainable city. We also have a system of master developers here, and the master plans controlled by the master developers are huge. This is a real opportunity to take some of I'll call them test projects, if you like, the Masdar and the Sustainable City, and to roll out the lessons learned there into a master development. By its very nature, Sustainable City, 2,500 people, we take those lessons and roll it out to 5 million people. It becomes even more efficient. It then rolls into business areas, and there's a lot more of the technology that we've heard about today and yesterday that can really be put in. There's an economy of scale under these master developments. So I think that the master developer really there's an onus on them to roll out some of these new cities or these new parts of the city, to take the lessons learned from the guys that are really going out and doing it and putting that in practice, so that us architects and developers who are dealing with individual plots, as often as not, we are hamstrung within a specific plot. But within a master plan where we are forced to follow a number of guidelines and sustainable practices, and to create, there's a master landscape, there's a local landscape. I think that's important. So with the government and the master developers, I think that the opportunity is there.
Phil, you wanting to add in?
Yeah, I think I'll add to that. Probably two of the big things that we try and have people take away when they come visit the Sustainable City is two of the myths that are in the industry. One is that sustainability has to cost more, and one is that there's no demand for a sustainable real estate project. So we've had great success commercially with our project. So from a commercial standpoint, there's a big demand for sustainable real estate projects, for sure. And then secondly, we're very competitive in the market with our price point for delivering a sustainable property to the market as well. So I really hope that, that those two arguments can be put to rest now, and we can move forward with a sustainable model for other developers to replicate and proliferate throughout the region or throughout the world.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I think we would want to thank you for, Phil, is that every time a developer says to a consultant, it can't be done here, we can point to a project like Sustainable City and say it's a commercial success. And that's fundamentally important. I think as professionals we need to sort of call out the successes and challenge the sort of assumptions that things don't work. I want to come back just very quickly to Rob and sort of extend something that Chris was mentioning about landscape architecture and the role of public spaces. If we look at cities like New York, Central Park, or even if we look at Champs-Élysées in Paris, these are sort of public spaces or places that are anchored in special landscape experiences. In looking at things like the Dubai Canal or Le Mer development or any number of developments, Rob, are you seeing that there is this increasing acceptance of the idea of landscape spaces as public spaces, but also tourist magnets?
Yeah, I think, to me, what's really interesting, and I've been in this part of the world for about 20 years, is how there's a lot more emphasis now on getting people outside and designing outdoor spaces. You look at retail, you look at City Walk 2, you look at Box Park, you look at the beach and so on, and Le Mer, which we've designed and is just opening up now, and Master LC. All of these developments are getting people outside and are trying to encourage more of a kind of public realm approach. So people effectively, rather than dragging people inside a shopping mall, you're getting people outside. And this, this is a tourist attraction, it's creating destinations, and it's celebrating the outdoor landscape of this part of the world as well. So I think it's interesting that that's happening, and I think it's an important step for the city that we do get people outside. And you can really see it's reflected in how everybody uses the city. I'm really pleased to see so much more outdoor function, outdoor recreation, because it has an impact on how the city operates socially. People mix more. There's more interaction. There's more outdoor markets. There's more human interaction, and that makes it a healthier city for people to live in. It makes it a more attractive city for people to live in, but also it creates destinations for tourists as well. So these are all self-sustaining impacts that this has on the city. So yeah, I think landscape is landscape, and I always say landscape and public realm is playing a really key role in driving the quality of life in this city and in ensuring that it is a destination.
Yeah, and I think again this is another example that we can call upon in the same way as Sustainable City, that we look at destinations like City Walk or Le Mer or Master Al Seif, and we can challenge those predominant responses of it's too hot for a project like that. We certainly as a professional, I see that every other day, that a client wanting to do a project in Saudi Arabia saying, I love City Walk, I want to do something like that. So again, I think that we can point to things, we have to point out the successes as well as, and really challenge the critique that things won't work. I think that's particularly important. I want to sort of perhaps ask one final question, really about this idea of smart cities and this almost dominant idea that it's about placing sensors in the public realm only. I think what I want to ask, perhaps in this case I'll ask Dan, is how do you think that planners of the landscape and the public realm can think about smartness in different ways, Dan?
Well, as a planner myself and an urban planning service we offer as a company, it's probably a profession and an industry that's kind of lost its way over the last 20 years or so. Since I kind of first graduated with an urban planning degree, it was kind of quite an exciting profession at that point. But now it's definitely been overtaken by smart as a profession, smart technology and smart advancements. And I think that's really kind of evident that we have failed as an industry, as urban planners. And I think many of Western consultants like myself have to take some responsibility for that. And the things that we've seen today with the drones and the airspace travel as an alternative to the congestion we have here in Dubai is just an obvious and classic example where we have failed and we've created a city which is over-congested. We haven't created enough opportunities for walking. There's disconnection between communities. And that's really led to the rise of smart technology as a solution to those problems. And it's something that kind of quite frustrates me as a professional that we didn't get this right in the first place. And it's great for all these smart technology companies that are here today, and they'll benefit and they'll capitalize on all of those failings very well. But you kind of think, well, if we created something in the first place which was flexible, which was adaptive to change, was easy to maneuver and move around, then we probably wouldn't need some of these solutions. And the point with these solutions being that if they do have to be retrofitted into an existing urban environment, then they are much more costly. They're much more difficult to implement. They are not as effective. So the cost for government goes up, the cost for citizens go up, and we're creating something which isn't as good as if you had a planning framework with all of those technologies integrated in the first place. And that can easily be done. And I think I read something recently by Stephen calling for this urban planning council, similar to we have in Abu Dhabi here. And that would be a great opportunity to sort of supplement and add on to the work of the municipalities here in the UAE and help kind of look at that bigger picture and introduce smart technology, of course, but make sure that it is holistic and it's not piecemeal type of intervention.
Yeah, I think you're probably being a bit harsh on yourself there, Dan. I often say to design and planning students that you are tasked with solving the most complex, difficult problem that the world has created in the history of humanity. And I think, obviously, urban planning is something that is not something that happened quickly or happens quickly. We've really seen in the last 20 years this incredible ramping up in the speed of urban development. So I think, again, we can only respond in the way that we can at the time that we plan. It's almost about adaptability in a way, perhaps. And so I'd say that smartness is almost about acknowledging what you don't know. We don't know what we don't know, so leave a system as an open framework and then come back and consistently re-examine. I'm conscious that we've got about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to leave enough time for people to ask some questions. So if anyone would like to ask any questions, just stick your hand up in the air and give us your name, company, and fire away with a question and who you'd like to direct it to.
Hello. Hi. I'm an urban designer. My name is Akshay Deshpande, and I work with KO International Consultants. This goes to what Chris had mentioned, is we used to live sustainably. Our cities were designed to be within their means. The question I want to ask is, the current model of development, especially if you see Dubai, is it's not urban blocks so much so as these developments, which may be sustainable within themselves, but really when you compare them to New York, London, some of the other cities in Europe, the urban framework is kind of disconnected. It's really a leapfrog kind of development where everything exists, but it's not continuous. So how does sustainability fit within this context, and how do you kind of solve this problem? which is happening, not just Dubai, a lot of cities in India also doing the same thing with these gated communities, and how do you kind of tackle that and create a sustainable city as a whole?
Over to you, Chris.
I mean, I think Dubai as a city it's a multi-center city. There's no city center. And whilst we would really love to see live-work environments for everybody, and everyone can walk to work, nobody needs to travel, in a city of 5 to 10 million, that's never really going to happen. And I think the focus on mass transit and sustainable mass transit is very important. We can move people fast and efficiently and energy efficiently, and there's new technologies coming. We don't just have to go up in the air in helicopters. I would hope we're at peak car right about now. Sheikh Zayed Road's up to about 14 lanes. It started at 2. The future is we're not far away from driverless cars. We're not far away from people not needing a car. It turns up at your door. Now, whether that's a car or whether that's something that picks up more people, there's smart transit. So with a city that is as it's built today, I think mass transit is a key factor there, and working on the density of the city, the correct density that people still feel connected to the city, but you don't go down the urban sprawl maybe of Los Angeles and some of the Australian cities where everyone has a quarter-acre plot. So density is critical, and the mass transit solution.
Okay, let's get another question in.
Good afternoon. I'm Edward Stellinger, Senior Manager, Landscape Architecture with Khatib and Alami. And I think my question is, I think something that we're all struggling with. We have lots of good ideas as to how to solve these problems. Our problem, largely, with some nice exceptions, is how do we implement them? So if I summarize my question is, how do we describe the long-term advantages in a fashion that convinces both government and developers to invest in those solutions now?
Who wants to have a crack at that?
Well, I mean, I just like to, that's a great question, thank you, and I think that that's a bigger question than probably what we can answer right now, but part of the thing is to prove that sustainability is viable. So that was a big thing that we talked about earlier, and I think once people see that, as Steve suggested, it can build some momentum and then start to get adopted by a bigger regional scale of things. So the implementation is difficult. There's so many stakeholders involved in these sort of paradigms and these questions. But the start is to show that there's a need for it, there's an interest in it, and that it's financially viable.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, I've certainly been in the scenario where we've planned sustainable infrastructure for a project that is, in the case of thinking about 200 million reals cheaper than a conventional solution, and it still hasn't stuck. And I'm sure many people in the room have had that experience, and I see people nodding. I think now we have to rely on the successes that we have. And, you know, even looking at things that were tried and didn't entirely succeed, we have to kind of build upon those approaches. We don't have too much more time. I'd like to get a couple more questions in. Do we have any others?
Hello, everybody. Thank you so very much. It was very interesting. My name is Tahra Noor, and I work for RTA. My question just comes from the very important information we had for the multifunctionality use of landscape. I think I'm interested in knowing or getting more to know about the role of proper sustainable landscape in treatment of heat island effect or the city heat. Up until now, I think many of the projects are just trees that we plant trees without really going into the identification of these trees and ingenuity, the kinds that are bred inside the UAE, the use of these, are they more of used to treatment of or weather conditions that are here, that are pertaining to this part of the world. So if there are any ways, or have you studied the role of the different kinds of landscaping in the treatment of the heat island effect? And in this, is there any pattern or any design that will be taken as a general or macro level that can be implemented on a city scale rather than in individual projects in the city? Thank you.
I'll have a quick go at that one. Certainly, there is the work that was done by Masdar Institute that clearly established very simple relationship. More tree cover equals reduced urban heat island effect, particularly in this region. So it's a very simple answer in a sense, but it was an accidental outcome that we've had in this region. No one actually planned for it. There is a bigger question about what sort of planting should it be, and there is an argument of should we be planting mainly native vegetation or not. My personal view is that we should plant everything that works here because we've modified the conditions so much. We've geoengineered the climate even. So we're not talking about a native scenario. I think we actually want to push harder and actually experiment more and actually, have an organised strategy. We now know the information of what we've been doing and its outcome. It's almost about how we can treat this as a starting point and say, it's already worked, how can we do it better? Rob, I'm not sure if you want to sort of weigh in on that.
No, I think, it's nice to have the idea that the city has a very native look to it. I don't know how practical it is, and I think it's reasonable to say that there are tree species you can bring in here which are adaptable, and as long as they're not self-seeding and propagating themselves and destroying everything around them. Obviously the key with reducing the heat island is generating as much shade as you can. So looking at tree species that create a canopy is the primary target. But it would be nice if it's interesting to me when you go to, recently I was in Las Vegas, and the city has a very desert look about it in types of planting that it's used. It's quite interesting in a way when you go out into the suburbs and get away from the strip. And it's very well done, and it's done throughout the city, and there's clearly a citywide strategy for maintaining that look. But it's a very hot city, and mostly that deals with sort of streetscapes. But I think there is a need to create a lot more shade. So I think bringing in species and looking for species that are effectively generating more shade cover is important.
Okay, we'll have one last question if there is another one.
Hi. It is not a question, it is clarification. My name is Khaldun from Dubai Municipality. In terms of the sustainability and environment protection, as you know, the sustainability, it is now in Emirate of Dubai, it is not options. It is become mandatory because the explosive expansion and urbanization in city like Dubai, you need to take smart solution to deal with these cases. I will give you some facts about what is the role and the effort of the Emirates of Dubai in this regard. The sustainability, it started since long time in Emirate of Dubai. I give you example, like we are daily used 500,000 cubic meter of treated sewage water in the irrigation and the landscaping. And at the same time, we have long plan to use treated sewage water in the district coolant plant. We have more than 100 district coolant plant in Emirate of Dubai. They spend lot of drinkable water daily, millions of the cubic meters. The other thing, we have the strategy for 2030 to reach zero waste in Emirate of Dubai. This, it can be happen through the converting of the waste to the energy. Not only that, also we have other strategies in 2050 that there is 70% from the power generation, it will be generated from the renewable energy. There is a lot of the fact, I like to highlight it on some fact in this regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I wholeheartedly agree. I think a lot of criticism was levelled at places like Dubai in the past. When you compare things like the recycling of water, the way that we're producing energy, this region is leading the world in many respects. So with that, I want to thank all of the panellists and thank you all for your questions.